So I'm actually not talking into a real microphone. This is just for the stream. So if it looks weird and you're trying to figure out why you can't hear me being projected, it's simply for the stream purposes. Elaine, is that coming through okay?
Yes, it is.
Okay, perfect. Well, glad to have all of you here. This is an exciting afternoon, and I have just a few moments of reflection here before turning things over to our guest speaker. You know, there's a term for really special people, a designation for people who are innovators and leaders and creators, builders and influencers, all wrapped up into one package. People who turn ideas into action and people who are able to blaze new trails, not only for themselves, but for other people. And that term, that designation, is founders. So think of the founders of our country. Think of founders of businesses and entire industries. Think of the founders of universities and civic organizations. Think of the founders of social and cultural movements. For you, what thoughts and images come to mind as you think about this term, founders? For me, I see founders as being some of the most admirable people in our society, because their efforts don't just create opportunities for themselves, but for other people. So their efforts empower others to follow in their footsteps and to build stronger and healthier economies and communities and even societies. And today we have the chance to hear from someone who is a true founder, Dr. Paul Schimmel. Dr. Schimmel is a professor of molecular medicine and chemistry at the Scripps Research Institute in San Diego. And prior to joining Scripps, he was the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Professor of Biochemistry and Biophysics at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Schimmel is an elected member of a dizzying array of societies: the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Medicine, the National Academy of Inventors, the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Now, to be inducted into one of those is a career milestone for most people. Dr. Schimmel has all of those. He has authored or co-authored more than 500 scientific research publications. Can you imagine doing that? That's an astonishing figure. Even more impressive, though, than the volume of this work is the impact of it. So throughout his career, Paul Schimmel's research has served as the foundation for life-saving therapy. So for example, his research led to the development of a treatment for infection-related sepsis, and that treatment has saved more than 300,000 lives. 300,000 lives. And it's prevented the amputation of countless limbs, so arms and legs. Nature magazine listed Paul Schimmel's work on the development of expressed sequence tags as one of the 4 foundational developments that launched the Human Genome Project. Of course, the Human Genome Project has been the foundation for modern medicine for quite some time now. Paul has founded 11 companies in the pharmaceutical industry. We're honored to be joined today not only by Paul, but also by Cleo, his wife and fellow classmate from OU's class of 1962. And Paul and Cleo have done a lot of things together, but today they are founders in maybe a new sense of that term. They're tremendous partners for our work to build a brighter future for Ohio Wesleyan University and our students. They're staunch advocates for all of you in this room, and they are working hand in hand with us to make Ohio Wesleyan University into one of this nation's premier liberal arts universities. Now, I would say to you, OU has a long and storied tradition of alumni who have engaged in successful entrepreneurship and innovation. And our alumni, many of whom I get a chance to meet all across the country, are the founders and CEOs of companies and organizations all across the country. Others lead teams of scientific researchers, and others yet are independent artists and writers and social media influencers. It is clear to me that Ohio Wesleyan, this is sort of new guy talk here, but it is clear to me that Ohio Wesleyan University is developing a niche as one of the leading universities for preparing the founders of tomorrow. Indeed, I think we are becoming Founder U in many ways. And we have Paul and Cleo Schimmel to thank for that. To our students here today, I'm just gonna leave you with one thought before introducing Dr. Schimmel. With the preparation you get from OU faculty like Professor Hurst, and from the inspiration and stories you get from Paul and Cleo Schimmel and others, you are all on track to become the next generation of founders, and that has to be extremely exciting for all of you. It certainly is for me. So with that, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Paul Schimmel.
Thank you. Well, I'm pleased and honored to be here with you today. You are the future of America, and you're the reason I'm here. I so believe that people like yourselves are the greatest hope we have for this nation as we go forward. So for me, it's very special, and for my wife, Cleo, to revisit Ohio Wesleyan and see your bright, shining faces. There's a dark cloud that always hangs over my dreams, and something I learned early on. Some years ago, when my wife and I had joined the Scripps Research Institute after 30 years at MIT, a close colleague and friend who I dearly loved, Ernest Beutler, was dying. After a lunch I had had with him a few years earlier, in which I was astonished by his diet, greasy hamburgers, French fries, wine, beer. He was the head of hematology, a brilliant hematologist. I couldn't believe the meal he was having. And he said to me, "Paul, don't worry about it. My mother's 102. However, in his late 70s, he developed a fatal blood cancer. And we had many talks as he was dying. And he said to me, his last words to me were, "Paul, your greatest danger as you go forward in life is dogma and consensus. Be aware of it and don't let yourself get caught up in it. You'll go nowhere if you do." About the same time, Steve Jobs was dying and gave an address at Stanford that has been much quoted. He was dying, he thought, because of the stress he encountered, not only building Apple, but at the same time developing Pixar, which was eventually sold to Disney for stock, and he became the largest shareholder in Disney. But he said the stress, the great stress of building the two companies simultaneously is what brought him down. That was not the most important thing he said. He tied in exactly to what Ernest Beutler said. In that speech, he said, "You may someday look back and realize that your life was a result of other people's thinking." Now consider this. When he developed the iPhone, his idea, explicitly stated, was to marry technology with the arts and humanities, the beauty, the elegant simplicity of his products. Steve Ballmer, at that time, was the CEO of Microsoft. And Steve said publicly, the iPhone will go nowhere. It's a niche product. It's dead in the water. Within 2 years, iPhone sales, dollar amount, was greater than all of Microsoft, across all Microsoft's platforms, from the software to the cloud to Xbox. Jobs did not embrace the fool. This comes from a song about dogma and consensus. Kissing a fool, or in other words, embracing a fool. A young man in love with a woman who listens to her colleagues who tell her he's not good enough for you. So she backs away, ends the relationship, but then realizes she was a victim of dogma and consensus. So entrepreneurship is about doing the impossible. And when you do the impossible, everybody's going to push back. Maybe most of all, your own mind will push back. This can't be done. Well, this is a kind of entrepreneurship about a man who made about $1 billion betting on horses at the Happy Valley racetrack in Hong Kong. This is a parimutuel track that brings in more dollars than all the tracks combined in the United States. But he was early on developing AI with computers for trying to understand how you could beat the horse game. In parimutuel betting, the house takes 15% off the top. You bet $1, you got 85 cents to start with. But he did it. He looked at the race track conditions, the humidity, the temperature, the horse's history, the jockey, aggregate all this together. And he really was not interested so much in the money as was to proving to himself that he was on top of early machine learning and AI. Most of that money went into his philanthropy, and he continues to make a lot of money today, sponsoring underprivileged children everywhere from the US to Africa and other projects. But this was a project which was impossible, and that's what entrepreneurship is about, doing the impossible. Well, what about this? The dwarfed, a famous one, Lavina Warren. How would you like to be 32 inches tall? Have all the normal body functions, in this case of a woman, the same desire for romance, love, affection, to be part of society, but you're 32 inches tall. What do? You join the circus and you're a freak, like an orangutan. That's what you can do. So she had a defect in human growth hormone, which can be tested for. And in the early days, 1960s, 1970s, until it was stopped, for those children diagnosed with a defect in human growth hormone, they could get a shot of human growth hormone extracted from the pituitary glands of cadavers. However, many of those pituitary glands in cadavers were contaminated with a prion that causes the human version of mad cow disease. So they stopped it. Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome. However, at that time, two entrepreneurs, Bob Swanson, who was a chemical engineering graduate from MIT, and Herb Boyer, who was a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, had the idea, with the emerging recombinant DNA, you might be able to make human growth hormone in the laboratory, in bacteria, using a clone gene. There was enormous pushback. Enormous pushback. Can't be done. It's not coming from a human cell. They had to fight for years. But they did produce it in the laboratory. The first shots made people sick because it was contaminated with something from bacteria. But they forged on, and eventually they were successful. Genentech was their company. So the entrepreneur really has a totally open mind and realizes what they're doing. There are no roads. Wayne Gretzky on the ice hockey rink is a kind of metaphor for where it's at. He was not the fastest or the biggest or the toughest player, but he consistently did not go to where the puck is going, which everybody else did. He somehow knew where it was going to go, and that's where he went. So, entrepreneurship, in a way, is a search for truth. It's a search for what's possible, which becomes the truth. It is possible to beat the odds in horse racing. It is possible to do something about the emerging dwarf. And this idea is one of the most uplifting ideas. If you go on your journey as an entrepreneur, you're really carving out a new world. You're doing something no one else has done before, and you're establishing more knowledge and more truth. So I always felt this sense of being uplifted as I went out, pushing against the dogma and consensus, seeing what the problems were, knowing that I would get pushback over and over, because I thought if we can do it, we've really done something that has not been done before, and contribute new knowledge, new truth for the betterment of society. So the persistent question always is, what is the road ahead? And the answer is, you don't need roads. You don't need nodes. You just have to have that sense of flexibility, adaptability, and focus on your goal so the path will become clear. So the road ahead is complicated. When I started my first company, Repligen Corporation, with a co-founder, we went to a dinner in Boston with a young venture capitalist who wanted to hear our pitch. I asked him, I said, of all the companies you invest in, what is the success rate? He said, if I invest in 10 companies, one will hit it out of the park. One or two will utterly fail, and the rest, they're mediocre. They just drift to and fro. So this is what you face, the odds. The odds. You want to be on that high road. You don't want to drift to and fro. And yet the odds say that's what you're going to do. So the question then is, why? Why is this drifting to and fro? What causes that? And for that, I got a lot of insight from sports, from a coach who had wonderful, pithy statements. John Wooden, the longtime coach of the UCLA Bruins. The Bruins were a failure when he came in. They had won nothing in way of titles. After 25 years, he won 10 NCAA titles, his team. When he left, long ago, decades ago, since then they've won one. But he could see clearly that in the past, They were doing a lot of things, a lot of workouts, a lot of pep talks. But it was just activity. Activity that really didn't result in achievement. And he knew how to achieve achievement, as does a great entrepreneur and CEO. It's so hard. So let's talk about the first company. It was Repligen Corporation. I founded with a colleague at MIT, Alexander Rich. Long ago, before any of you were around. We went on the NASDAQ. We grew to 300 employees. And we were ranked in all of the news as one of the top technology shops in biotech at that early time in all of the US. And then things went wrong. 1996. We dropped from 300 to 3 employees. We're going bankrupt. So, I was the co-chairman. I was the co-founder. I searched in my mind, who can I find to save this sinking ship before it's too late? And someone did come to my mind. What was the phenotype? A man who was a tough Irishman, knew biotech, and I knew was a fighter if there ever was one. I told him, look, you come in, I'll give you anything you want, all the stock options, whatever you want, but save this thing, save it. We got down on the NASDAQ to 69 cents a share. Let's look at the company today. We turned around from that dismal position. It was one of the most meaningful and most stressful times of my life. But we had that rare CEO, that rare person who had this enormous ability to adapt and figure his way when there were no roads, to get the path, to get us back. So you can ask, what did I learn from this? Many years ago, I was giving a lecture at the American University in San Juan, Puerto Rico. After the lecture, a sailor came over to me. He was a biologist. He had sailed from St. Martin's to Puerto Rico to hear my lecture. So we had lunch. We talked a lot about boats because I like to sail. And he told me he built his boat, a 42-foot hull, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and then sailed it to the Caribbean with his wife. So I said to him, I said, what do you do when you hit the Bermuda Triangle and there's a huge hurricane or storm? He said, we accept it. What we do, he said, we go below and we lash ourselves down. We build boats with good keels. But, he said, many people die. Why do they die? Because they go up on deck and they're terrified and mesmerized by the storm. And they're just swept overboard. They say, I'm going to die, and they let themselves die. And then his point was, people break before boats do. I asked myself, what happened at Repligen? When it started sinking, everybody abandoned ship. We're down to 3 people. They're all running like crazy. They broke. But that core of 3, and the person I brought in, Walter Hurley, they established a culture, a mini culture, and that's the boat. the culture they created in the nick of time was the boat. So this is what it is. This sense of having a culture that is resilient and is willing to take blows, get caught up in the hurricane, but don't break. Now here's an idea I had that failed. I've had many ideas that failed. This is one of them. So I had a new idea, I thought a great idea for anti-infectives. Anti-infectives are not that popular to develop in the pharmaceutical industry because it costs so much money. You can easily blow through $1 billion and get nothing. Why? The FDA requires huge clinical trials, thousands and thousands of people, and no one wants to pay that price. They just don't want to go there. But always looking for something new, and I thought I also had something that could be maybe a little economical. So it was based on one of my ideas, and a company I started with a colleague at MIT, another colleague named Julius Riebeck. The company is Chemist Pharmaceuticals. We started in 1993, and my co-founders were Julius and a venture capitalist, John Clark, who I eventually did 6 companies with out of Cardinal Partners. Only seed money would go in. You had to prove that you were on the right path. And once you got on the right path, got some intellectual property, he would add more money and bring in other venture capitalists. That was our model. So, technical term, tRNA synthetases are an area of expertise of mine. I've worked on them all my career, but I thought they'd be ideal as new targets for new anti-infectives. When we had serious problems, once we got some good candidates, getting into humans, bioavailability, toxicity, and so on. So we were on the precipice of failure, and we needed to consider alternatives. We burned through 200 million. Poof. And here we are, headed for bankruptcy once again. So, a lot of discussion, arguments, debates within the group that was left. And I had to step back once again and ask myself, how are we going to solve this one? How are we going to get out of this maze? I asked myself, well, what is the essence of our problem? There's so many particulars that people are discussing, so many issues that people are going through. What is the essence? And I thought, you know, I've got to make this simple. There's got to be a simple concept here. And let's focus on that and see if we can do something by thinking in a simple way. So I had to accept, first of all, that I had failed and that it was going to be inevitable. I was not going to play in the minor leagues. That didn't interest me. So I began to reflect. The crack of the bat. Baseball. This is an image from the 1930s, taken by this man named Harold Edgerton, who was the founder of stroboscopic light photography, where you make very rapid flashes of light to catch and take a photograph to catch instantaneous moments in motion. So here, if you look closely, the ball is compressed as it meets the bat. And there's a loud crack if you hit it square on. So, I relate this now to a Friday evening in June in Boston at Fenway Park. It all made sense once I focused on the essence. The Blue Jays were playing the Red Sox. I used to play catcher. I was right behind home plate where I loved it. And I was with a colleague from MIT, Professor Garrenti, who I discovered is a walking encyclopedia on baseball facts. Ask him any question. It's like going on ChatGPT. He'll tell you the answer. And he's right. But he wasn't focusing on the essence. At the end of 4 innings, Boston leads 8-1. Great. But I was not great. I turned to him, I said, look, they may be ahead 8-1, but the Boston pitcher is losing it. Do you realize he was lucky in the 4th inning, top of the 4th, because that bat started to crack on the Toronto side. They were hitting long fly balls, hard bullet ground balls. That pitcher is done. But the coach wouldn't take him out. Boston lost the game. That pitcher gave a bunch of runs before the coach took him out. He didn't get the essence. The essence was the crack of the bat. So what's the essence for Cubists? It was to develop new anti-infectives. Had nothing to do with Paul Schimmel. Nothing to do with Paul Schimmel's ideas. Had to do with getting a new anti-infective. And for that, I was blessed with another Irishman, Frank Talley, who knew a lot about anti-infectives and worked as our chief medical officer. And he knew where to go with another medicine that had been dropped by Eli Lilly, and we picked it up. We raised a lot of money from investors. I think they paid $1.38 for our shares, but we needed to try it, and it worked. It worked beautifully. So, it has a wide reach. I was at an event on Nantucket years ago, and a woman came up to me, quite attractive. I didn't know who she was. I found out who she was. In front of everybody, she grabs me like this and hugs me close. Oh, great. What's this about? She said, you saved my life. I said, I'm not aware of that. But it's a nice hug. She said, no. She said, I was dying. They gave me the drug, vancomycin, for sepsis. I had sepsis. I have no idea how I got it. But they said I was dying. But there was a new drug for vancomycin-resistant bacteria. So they gave it to me. It's called Cubicin, and it saved me. I got an updated figure on the lives that have been saved by Cubicin. Worldwide, it's at least 800,000 and still counting. People who hospitals claim, not me, but hospitals said, these people were dying, it was their last hope, we gave them Cubicin. Probably 2 or 3 million arms and legs as well. So, this raised to me the question, who are the humanitarians? I was at a meeting in Houston, kind of a token scientist, with all of these humanitarians, including the Dalai Lama and Octavio Paz, who at that time was visiting US from Mexico. He was a Nobel laureate in literature, a Jewish rabbi, and a Catholic priest, and a Protestant clergyman, and Schimmel. So they asked me, they said, Professor Schimmel, do you have any comments about our humanitarian concerns and efforts? I said, imagine this. Imagine there's a child dying in Mexico in a hovel with her parents. You call in the Catholic priest to administer last rites. She's got a couple hours to live. All of a sudden, a young woman working in a lab in biotech comes to the door and says, hey, I've got a medicine. I heard about your plight. It's not approved by the FDA, but we think it will be. Can I shoot her up? The woman comes in, shoots her up. The child survives. Now I ask you, I ask you, who is a humanitarian here? If you talk to the parents, yes, and comfort's important. Love is important. It's terribly important, support. But the child is alive. I said, I think the venture capitalists, these young men and women working in laboratories to find new cures and diseases, they are great humanitarians. What did I learn from the Cubist experience? It was a measure of what I call corporate intelligence. The essence of intelligence, as seen by Stephen J. Hawkins. It's measured by the ability to adapt. It's not the strongest or the fittest that survive. It's the ones who best adapt to change throughout all of life. Well, let's talk about Alnylam. This is now the third company. A new kind of therapeutic called RNAi, RNA interference. We didn't know it existed 25 years ago, the phenomenon, all new biology. I co-founded it with colleagues in 2002. We went public on the NASDAQ in 2006. The name Alnylam was something I threw out as a possibility. A lot of pushback. No one could pronounce it. I told people that's the point. They'll remember something they can't pronounce if we're successful. And it'll drive us to be successful, and everybody will know what it is. And it'll be so unique. In any event, if you look at the Orion constellation, the brightest star is called Alnylam. And it symbolizes the passion for discovery. If there was ever a company full of passion, Alnylam. But we ran into trouble, as we always do. Here's a news clip. Our first clinical trial, we burned through tens of millions of dollars. It failed by a whisker. You had to have a p-value on your primary indication of 0.05 or better. We were like 0.065. FDA kicked us out. And we weren't going to invest any more money on it. We just couldn't. We were burned out. But here's the way it looks today. More than 2,000 employees. All kinds of clinical trials. We've got many approved medicines and more coming. But we went through hell again to get there. Enormous stress and challenge. So you can ask, how did you build this company? You know, what did you learn from the Alnylam experience? We go back. And really Alnylam, the CEO at that time, the founding CEO, John Maraganore, we had a private conversation. at a cocktail party in Boston. And I was on the board of directors, I was a founder, but often we didn't have a chance to have a private conversation. I said, John, what is your number one criteria for hiring a new employee? What is your number one thing you want to do out loud? He said, culture. It's all about culture. Great enterprises come from great culture. And they have a passion for their purpose. So, if you look through this book, came out a few years ago by Harvard Professor Eric Weiner, he made a very interesting point. He said, if you congregate together people who are like-minded, who have a passion, and have this 24/7 mentality, you will build an ecosystem of geniuses. That's why you had a flowering. So set up a lab there with a couple of colleagues, and we did what we call wildcat drilling. A group in Hong Kong and a group in San Diego going back and forth. And then I had to crowdsource. The problem was too complicated for me alone. I had to gather up a lot of different kinds of people. So I got a group in Hong Kong, in La Jolla, in Florida at the time, and at Stanford. And I made 35 trips to Hong Kong. And we were looking, and we found a treatment for sarcoidosis. It's a horrible disease, and it's growing. This is a lung at the end stages of interstitial lung disease. You die. Environment, inflammatory diseases. We discovered what's here. It wouldn't mean anything to you. It's a sketch of a protein fragment. It's natural, what we call a splice variant. New and it's potent. And we've now put it in humans. It's great anti-inflammatory, anti-fibrotic activity. So here are some slides from a non-human primate. The top left, that's what a healthy lung should look like. No fibrosis, no inflammation. But here's an injured lung, full of inflammation, full of fibrosis. And then using IV, you can see how much of it resolves. So now we're in a phase 3 clinical trial. Once again, burning through money like crazy with a very depressed stock price. So I don't know how it's going to turn out. But we will continue until we get there. What did I learn from ATIRE? I learned a lot. I learned a lot. We all need each other. And it's much better, if you want to go far, to go together. At the end of the day, as you could tell from what I said, an entrepreneur eventually is a fox on an iceberg. It was a bitter cold February morning in Cambridge when we were at MIT. And Cleo and I wanted to get out. Snow on the ground, ice everywhere. And we decided we'd drive to Cape Cod and go out to a tip called Penzance Point at Woods Hole. Woods Hole is a hole in the water, literally, which is a shortcut from going from one part, Buzzards Bay, to another part, Nantucket Sound. It flows east-west. The trouble is there are rocks, submerged rocks on either side of this hole. So if you go through that hole with your boat and you know what you're doing, it's a big shortcut. But many a boat got caught in the strong tidal currents, got smashed into the rocks and sunk. But we knew it was an interesting spot. So we went out there. The only time in all my history in Boston, the ocean was frozen in places, absolutely frozen. And there are icebergs floating everywhere. And we saw something astonishing. We saw a fox on a nice floe. The fox had gone out looking for food on a piece of ice. Maybe he saw a dead fish, maybe he saw something. It broke off, and he was carried now by this enormous current through Woods Hole, going like a rocket, and absolutely terrified, absolutely terrified. So I thought to myself, I know that feeling. And then I thought of an experience Cleo and I had in Florida. A young immigrant entrepreneur, no higher education, from Argentina, Luis Castro. A wife, 2 children, and a mother immigrated into South Florida. And somehow he had the guts to go out and start a company that installed lighting, outside lighting, in South Florida. So we saw him one day. He was a fox on an iceberg, terrified. his wife came. She was just about collapsing. It was the financial crisis of '08, '09. The business went dead. He couldn't pay his loans. And the Small Business Administration was taking over his assets and auctioning them off. So he was totally flat, in bankruptcy, going into bankruptcy. He didn't know what to do. I thought about it for a while. I talked to Cleo about it. I said, look, I'll go to the auction. Now, what do you got in there? He said, well, I got about $50,000 of inventory, and I got my truck, my special truck. Okay, that's what they're going to take. He said, yeah, the SBA's taking it, and they're auctioning it off. I said, fine. I tell you what, I'll go to the auction, I'll buy it. I'll get the bid, and then I'll give it back to you. Just give it to you. He said, you can't do that. I said, I will do that. And so I got the bid. I gave it all back to him. He said, I have to pay you back. I said, you don't have to pay me back. The fact that you are an immigrant entrepreneur, we need a lot more of you people in this country who have the will to make the effort. I said, that's payment enough for me. Bring in more people like you. He said, no, I'm going to pay you back. So he insisted that he do work for us for 2 or 3 years to pay us back. He didn't have any money. So it was meaningful to us. It was something that we felt uplifted us. So what is the phenotype of the entrepreneurs who make it? Here again, we turn to sports. One of the great sports coaches of all time was a man named Bear Bryant, the Alabama Crimson Tide, another superstar coach. He was asked, how do you choose boys out of high school? What are you looking for? He said, I put them in 3 bins. I don't want the ones who are good and don't know that, and know they're good. I don't want the ones who are not good and know they're not good. I only want the ones who are good and don't know they're good. Why? Why? They have the will to make the effort. John Wooden, the previous coach I mentioned, I asked one of his former players, who I know, big guy, of course, basketball, UCLA. He's now only 10 years younger than me. I said, what was it like working for Wooden? What's the most important thing he told you? He said, the most important thing he told me is that effort counts more than talent. The people who are good and know they're good, he said the problem is they're too confident. They've had it too easy. But the people who are aspirational, who have the will to make the effort, they can become great. So, why do we never lose the will to succeed? And never kiss a fool, never embrace a fool? You lose your purpose. It breaks you. That's why we never kiss a fool. Thank you very much. I'm good if you're good.
that was one of the things I took from, I'll just speak loud, the story of the sailor in Bermuda's fighting back that fear. Do you do you have a comment to make about that? Because it can be, I think, for many people, especially young people, especially people who are just embarking on a new journey, there can be a lot of fear of failure, fear of exposure. How in your life have you fought that back?
You're absolutely right. When I was a boy, I was pretty much a street kid. And outside, we lived in kind of a 4-room box outside of New York City at one time. And one night, I think it was Halloween, 12 years old, I got into an altercation. I may have caused the fight, I don't know. I got smashed on the head, bleeding everywhere. All down my face, my eyes. I didn't want to go home. By then I had learned if you're going to be out in the streets, you transmute pain. That's just the way it has to be. But I had to go home because my eyes were covered. So I went into the back door where we had a little closet-sized kitchen. My mother came out. She wiped my eyes. She cleaned me up. And as I recall, gave me a pat and sent me back out in the night. She didn't have to say anything. She said, Paul, in my mind, not by words, don't be stopped. Don't be stopped. No matter how hard you get hit, don't be stopped. So years later, Repligen, we brought in a Nobel laureate named Salvador Luria, who was sick with prostate cancer and dying. But he had 2 or 3 years left to live. He was a wonderful advisor. And really, his mind was so rich and deep. He was so genuine. I would say, philosophically, he was a left of Karl Marx. And that wasn't me, but we had a great relationship. So when he's dying, I talked to him just before he died. He was at his deathbed, and I'm on a short distance away on the phone. And I talked to him. He said, Paul, he knew about Repligen and its woes. He said, don't be stopped. Keep on it. So, fear, like that fox on iceberg, many, many times. I agree. For some reason, those words ring in my mind, and I don't know why, but they somehow comfort me, and I can get through it. But it's very hard. I say to myself, I will make it work. I will make it work. I will make it work. Like a robot. But if I sit there and think of all the possibilities, do I do drugs to calm my nerves? No. Do I have sleepless nights? Yes. Am I full of anxieties? Yes. But I also flip and realize I'm just very fortunate, even in this horrible situation, to be able to keep going. So those are my stories. But it's all about I just cannot be stopped. But I can change course. I can adapt. And I'm quick to say I'm wrong. And I also learned as part of this, there's no limit to how far a person can go if you always give the other guy the credit. But take blame for the problems.
Thank you, Dr. Schimmel. I think one of the most accessible messages, and there were many here, is that effort and persistence come before talent. There's a lot of talent in this room, but just remember effort and persistence come even before that. And for that gift of knowledge, I'm grateful. How about a round of applause for Dr. Ernest?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep, good. Yeah, thanks.